Picture this. Calcutta, India. The year is 1918. The monsoon has soaked the streets to mud. Outside a railway station, a young man sits cross-legged on the ground, barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin cotton robe. He is 24 years old. Around him, people are dying. Cholera, typhoid, starvation. A woman collapses 10 feet away from him, her infant still pressed to her chest. No one stops. The crowd flows around her like a river around stone. The young man rises. He does not call for help. He does not look for a hospital. He simply kneels beside her, lifts her head from the mud, and begins to pray. His name is Sadhu Krishnapal, and what happens next will be witnessed by British officials, Indian police, and a German doctor who will later say, publicly in writing, that what he saw defied every principle of medicine he had ever been taught. But this is not just a story about what happened that afternoon in Calcutta. This is the story of what it cost one man to become a vessel that God could use. The years of walking barefoot through snow, the nights sleeping in caves, the friends who called him mad, the government officials who tried to have him arrested, the Christian missionaries who refused to believe him, the Hindu priests who wanted him dead. And underneath all of it, the question that he never stopped asking, that drove everything he did, from the moment he was a boy until the morning they found him alone in the Himalayas, his sandals neatly placed at the entrance to a mountain pass he never came back from. The question was simple. Is Jesus actually alive? He was born in 1894 in a village in Punjab that smelled of wheat fields and cattle and cooking fires. His father, a man of standing in the Sikh community, had built a home with thick clay walls and a courtyard where the children played in the evenings. His mother was the kind of woman who seemed to carry stillness with her wherever she went. She read scripture every morning before the household woke. She fed the poor from her own kitchen. She prayed not with noise, but with a quality of concentration that made the room feel different. She was the one who first told him about Jesus, not as a foreign god, not as the property of the British. She read to him from the Gospels alongside the Gurbani, the sacred texts of the Sikhs, and she told him that truth was truth no matter where it was found. He was 6 years old. He sat in her lap and listened and did not fully understand, but something settled in him that did not leave. She died when he was 9. There are losses that reshape a person from the inside out. This was one of them. After his mother's death, the stillness she had carried disappeared from the house. His father grieved in the way that practical men grieve, by working, by providing, by not speaking of what hurt. His older brothers moved forward. Krishnapal could not. He searched for his mother's stillness in the Sikh scriptures, and found wisdom there but not the thing itself. He searched for it in the Vedas, and found philosophy but not peace. At 12, he picked up his mother's copy of the Gospels and threw it into the courtyard fire. He was 13 when he decided to end his life. He had planned to lie on the railway tracks at 4:30 in the morning, when the first train from Ludhiana came through. He knelt on the cold ground in the dark and prayed, not to Jesus, not to anyone in particular, simply a raw demand that if God was real, God would have to show himself before the train arrived. The train did not come that night. There was no angelic visitation, no earthquake, no voice from a burning bush. What happened by his own account was this. The room filled with light, not the light of a lamp, not the light of the coming dawn, a light that he described for the rest of his life as warm and personal and unbearably kind. And in that light he saw a figure, and knew without being told, without any explanation who it was. He went to his father at 5 in the morning and said, "I have seen Jesus." His father thought he had lost his mind. What followed were years that would have broken most people, and nearly broke him. His father was not a cruel man, but he was a man of his community, and his community had no category for a Sikh boy who had become a follower of Christ. First came the arguments, long, patient conversations at the kitchen table, his uncles and the family priest laying out every reason this was foolishness. Then came the pressure, the subtle social exclusion, the invitations that stopped coming, the neighbors who looked away. Then came the morning his father placed a meal in front of him at breakfast, and Krishnapal ate half of it before his brother told him quietly that it had been laced with poison. He was 16 years old. He survived. He did not leave the village angry. He left with almost nothing, a thin cotton robe and his mother's copy of the Gospels, which he had retrieved from the fire pit, its edges charred but its pages intact. He became a sadhu, a wandering holy man. In the tradition of his culture, this was a recognized thing. A man who renounces comfort and possessions and walks the roads, dependent on God for food and shelter, available to anyone who needs him. But a Christian sadhu was not a recognized thing. He was too Indian for the missionaries and too Christian for the Hindu priests. He belonged to no institution, carried no denominational credentials, received no salary from any organization. He simply walked. For the next decade, he walked tens of thousands of miles across the Indian subcontinent, Punjab, Rajasthan, Bengal, the hill stations of Sikkim, the border passes into Nepal and Tibet, where foreigners were not permitted, and where the temperature in the high passes dropped to a cold that killed men who were not prepared for it. He wore thin cotton robes in the snow. He slept in doorways and caves, and once, memorably, in a stable that smelled of horse and wet hay, which he mentioned in a letter to a friend in England, with what reads now as gentle amusement. He did not do this to impress anyone. He did it because the people who lived at the edge of maps, in places where no doctor came and no missionary ventured, still needed someone to sit with them. And sitting with people, in his experience, required a body that had learned not to demand comfort. He carried no medicine bag, no equipment, no organizational structure. He prayed for the sick, and sometimes they recovered. He sat with the dying and helped them not to be afraid. He told everyone he met about the Jesus he had seen in that room at 4:30 in the morning, and he told it the same way he would tell a friend about meeting someone remarkable, directly, without performance, as simple fact. The healings were not his goal. They were, in his words, simply the confirmation that his message was true. The same Jesus who healed in Galilee was still alive. That was the point. Everything else was evidence. It was in Tibet where the thing happened that people have never been able to explain away. He had crossed the border illegally. There was no legal way to enter, and had been preaching in a village near Tong in the high plateau country, a place of bone-dry wind and altitude so extreme that breathing itself was labor. The Tibetan authorities arrested him. This was not unusual. He had been arrested before. What made this arrest different was what happened next. He was thrown into a dry well. Not a prison, not a cell, a well perhaps 30 feet deep, with no way to climb out and a locked cover overhead. There was no food and no water. The decomposing remains of previous prisoners were at the bottom. He was left there to die. On the third night, the cover opened. A rope descended. Someone pulled him up. By the time he reached the surface and turned to see who had helped him, there was no one there. The cover of the well was locked again from the outside. He walked back to the village the next morning. The Tibetan official who had ordered his imprisonment saw him coming down the road and went pale. He asked how Krishnapal had gotten out. Krishnapal told him. The official had the well inspected. It was locked. The key was on the official's own belt. He was permitted to leave Tibet without further interference. He told this story carefully, without embellishment, many times. He did not tell it to prove he was special. He told it because it was what happened, and because it was the clearest illustration he knew of a principle he had come to understand, that a man entirely dependent on God was not without resource. He was, in fact, safer than he knew. His influence spread in ways that had nothing to do with organization. A Swedish bishop met him on a train in northern India in 1920 and wrote afterward that the encounter had changed the way he understood prayer. A group of Oxford students heard him speak and said afterward that he made the Gospels sound like news rather than history. A Japanese pastor hosted him for 2 weeks and later said it was the most significant 2 weeks of his ministry. A woman in Edinburgh, Scotland, a schoolteacher named Catherine, attended his lecture, went home and spent 3 hours on her knees, and then wrote in her journal, "I had forgotten that he was actually real. He came to the West twice, in 1920 and again 1922. Churches in Switzerland, Germany, England, Australia were full when he spoke. Theologians who had spent careers debating the nature of miracle found themselves unsettled by a man who discussed it with the matter-of-fact calm of someone reporting the weather. He did not argue. He had simply been there. But he never felt comfortable in the West, not because he disliked the people. He was genuinely fond of the people, but because the distance between belief and practice, between what people said on Sunday and how they lived on Monday, seemed to him very wide. He said so, gently but clearly. He was not always thanked for it. He returned to India and continued walking. And then there was Calcutta, 1918. Though he had been through similar scenes in a dozen cities before this one. The woman on the ground outside the railway station. The infant still pressed to her chest. The crowd moving around her. He knelt beside her and prayed. Not a long prayer, not a performed prayer. A brief, direct appeal to someone he believed was actually present and actually listening. The woman opened her eyes. The German doctor who witnessed this, a man named Brenner who was working with a relief organization and who had no religious sympathies whatsoever, wrote in his field report that the woman had displayed no vital signs when he reached her 30 seconds after Krishnapal began praying, that her eyes had opened, her breathing had resumed, and that within 10 minutes she had sat up and was nursing her child. He wrote that he had no explanation. He was specific about this. He was a careful man. He wrote that he had no explanation. Krishnapal stayed in Calcutta for 3 weeks after that. He visited the slums, he sat with the dying, he held children. He did not preach on a platform or organize a crusade or hand out literature. He simply moved through the streets like a man who had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. And people followed him the way people follow anyone who does not seem afraid. He was not afraid of poverty. He was not afraid of disease. He was not afraid of death. He had looked at his own death at 13 years old, alone on a railway track in the dark. And something had met him there that had permanently reorganized what he was afraid of. He wrote, "This is one of the things people forget about him." Between the walking and the praying and the crossing of mountain passes, he wrote. His books were translated into more than 30 languages during his lifetime. At the Cross and the Search After Reality and Visions in Reality. Simple titles. The contents were not simple. He wrote the way he spoke, directly, without theological armor, about what he had actually experienced. He did not write to defend a doctrine. He wrote to describe what he had seen. A pastor in rural Ontario, a man named Arthur Fletcher, who had grown tired of institutional religion and was on the edge of leaving the ministry, read at the Cross in the winter of 1921. He later wrote that reading it was like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. He stayed in the ministry. He spent the next 40 years pastoring the same small congregation in a town near Georgian Bay. He described Krishnapal's writing as one of the 2 or 3 things that had, in his phrase, kept the fire lit. That is how influence actually works. Not always through the 10,000 people at the outdoor crusade, though those matter too. Sometimes through a book in a snowstorm in Ontario and a man alone in a cold house deciding to keep going. Behind the simplicity of his public life was a private discipline that almost no one saw. He rose before dawn. He prayed for hours before he would speak to anyone. Not liturgical prayer, though he knew the forms and respected them, but the kind of prayer that is less a recitation and more a conversation, sustained over time, between a person who has decided to be honest and a God who he was convinced was actually there. He read scripture not as a scholar establishing positions, but as a traveler consulting a map. He fasted regularly, not to earn anything, but because, in his experience, something in the body quieted when it was not being constantly fed, and in that quiet, he could hear more clearly. He was not ascetic in the punishing sense. He was not trying to hurt himself into holiness. He was simply uninterested in comfort for its own sake. He had discovered that the less he needed, the less fear he carried, and the less fear he carried, the more useful he was to the frightened people he kept finding on the roads. He said once, in a letter to a friend in London, "The secret is not in the extraordinary moments. Anyone can be brave once. The secret is in the 1,000 ordinary mornings when no one is watching and you choose, again, to believe." That is the sentence people keep returning to. Long after the healings have been debated and the well in Tibet has been argued over, and the question of what exactly the German doctor saw in Calcutta has been discussed in seminary classrooms, that sentence remains. Not because it is spectacular, because it is true. He mentored almost no one formally. He had no school, no organization, no certification process. But the people who spent time with him described the experience the same way, across decades and continents. A young Indian pastor named Samuel Iyer, who traveled with him for 6 months in 1921, said that what struck him was not any individual miracle, but the quality of Krishnapal's attention. That when he looked at you, he was actually looking at you. that he was not thinking about the next city or the next meeting. He was entirely present. Iyer said, "I learned more about how to pray from watching him make tea than from any book I have read." That is not a small thing. That is in fact the whole thing. A Canadian woman named Dorothy Whitmore, who met him during his 1922 visit, and who later spent 20 years as a missionary in South Asia herself, wrote in her memoir that the single question he had asked her during their conversation had stayed with her for life. He had asked, "What are you actually afraid of?" Not rhetorically, not as a technique. He had genuinely wanted to know, and when she told him, he had nodded and said simply, "Yes, that is the thing to bring to God." She wrote, "He made faith seem not like a performance to be given, but like a relationship to be honest in. The last years of his life are partly mystery." He continued walking. He continued crossing into Tibet, which continued to be dangerous, and which he continued to do without apparent concern. He was in his late 30s now, still lean, still moving with the economy of someone who has walked long distances for many years. In 1929, he told several friends that he felt his work was nearly finished. He was not dramatic about it. He said it the way a farmer says the harvest is almost in, as observation rather than announcement. He wrote a final letter to a friend in Germany, thanking him for a lifetime of correspondence, and noting that the Gospels had not changed in 19 centuries and showed no signs of doing so, and that this was, in his view, the most reliable fact he knew. In April of 1929, he walked north toward the Himalayan passes. His sandals were found at the entrance to one of the high passes above the tree line. He was never found. The mystery is real. People have debated it ever since. Was it an accident in the high altitude, as most practical people assume? Was it something else, as others have believed? What is not debated is what he left behind. The books are still being translated. There are currently 23 active editions in languages, ranging from Korean to Swahili to Portuguese. The Samuel Iyer who traveled with him spent the next 30 years planting churches in Tamil Nadu. Dorothy Whitmore's mission in South Asia trained over 600 national pastors before she retired. The Swedish bishop who met him on the train wrote a book about their conversation that influenced a generation of European theologians. Arthur Fletcher's small congregation in Ontario produced, over 4 decades, 11 people who went into full-time ministry. None of this is tallied anywhere. There is no Krishnapal Ministries International. There is no headquarters, no annual report, no social media presence. There is only the ongoing fact of what happened when one barefoot man decided to take the Gospels seriously and walk. He was not special because of who he was. He was not from a prestigious family, though his family had standing. He was not educated in the formal sense, though he was deeply read. He had no organizational backing, no denominational support, no wealthy donors, no platform in the modern sense of the word. What he had was this: a night on a railway track at 13 years old, and a light that had come, and a decision, made that morning at 5 o'clock and remade every morning for the rest of his life, to believe that what he had seen was real. The miracles came from the prayer came from the belief came from the encounter. But the encounter alone was not enough. Plenty of people have extraordinary experiences and do nothing with them. What set Krishnapal apart was the willingness, every single morning for 35 years, to do it again. To get up before dawn, to pray when nothing was happening, to walk the next road, to sit with the next dying stranger, to ask the next frightened person, "What are you actually afraid of?" The same God who met him on that railway track is not retired. The same Jesus who walked into that room is not a historical figure. He is a present fact, and the question he is still asking, the one he put to a skinny boy in Punjab in 1907 and to every generation since, has not changed. The question is not whether he can use you. The question is whether you are willing to be used. The harvest is still waiting. The roads are still long. And the sandals at the entrance to the pass are not an ending. They are an invitation.